Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that everything you own, your home, your car, your bank account, even the clothes on your back, no longer belongs to you. Every contract you ever signed is void. You cannot sue, nor can you be sued. Legally, you do not exist. You are property. This was not a nightmare. This was the reality for every married woman in Tudor England. The king who famously beheaded 2 of his wives was merely the most visible enforcer of a system that had already erased the legal existence of half the population. This is the story of coverture, the law that transformed marriage into ownership and women into possessions. Understanding it will make Henry VIII's reign look very different. History remembers the 6 wives. Those who died were divorced or executed, but it largely forgot the hundreds of thousands of ordinary women subjected to illegal death while still breathing. If you are drawn to the hidden realities of power, to court records and legal manuscripts that reveal how society actually functioned rather than the sanitized versions taught in school, every view, like, or subscription helps uncover these buried stories. Now back to the narrative, because what comes next casts every injustice you've ever heard into stark relief. Picture yourself in 1535, standing in a modest parish church in Yorkshire. You are 19, the daughter of a prosperous wool merchant. Your father spent years teaching you the trade. How to negotiate with shepherds, judge the quality of fleece, and keep accurate accounts. Since age 15, you have been running parts of his business. Today is your wedding day. You are marrying the son of another merchant family. You wear your finest gown, purchased with your own earnings. Hidden beneath your skirts in a leather purse are the coins you saved over the years. After the ceremony, a feast will celebrate the union, partly funded by your dowry of £200, a fortune in an era when a skilled craftsman might earn £5 per year. The priest begins the vows. You repeat them. Your new husband slips a ring onto your finger, and in that instant you cease to exist. Not physically, you are still alive, but legally you are dead. The independent merchant's daughter who walked into this church, with her own earnings, property, and legal identity, has vanished. In her place stands a femme covert, a woman legally covered by her husband. The law is unambiguous. The doctrine of coverture, inherited from Norman French law after 1066, is almost poetic in its cruelty. Under this legal fiction, husband and wife were one person, but that person was the husband. Let's be clear about what this meant. Your £200 dowry is his now. The coins in your purse, his. The gown you are wearing, his. Any wages you earn from weaving, selling goods at market, or any labor at all are immediately his property. Your earnings, past and future, belong entirely to him. It goes even further. You cannot enter into a contract. Any attempt to make agreements for goods or services is void. You cannot sue someone who wrongs you. Your husband must do it on your behalf. You cannot be sued for debts because, legally, you are incapable of incurring them. If someone slanders you, damages your property, or assaults you, you have no recourse. Your husband is your only legal voice. Consider the practical implications. You go to the market to sell wool. Buyers are confused. They have dealt with your family for years, but now they are told to deal only with your husband. Attempting to collect payment for goods sold before your marriage proves futile. Those debts are now his property. Your father had set aside a small workshop with looms and spinning wheels as part of your marriage portion. You had planned to run it independently, employing other women, building a business. But under coverture, you cannot legally hire workers, sign contracts with suppliers, or even rent the building without your husband's involvement. If he is supportive, he might act as your proxy, allowing you to continue operations. But if he is indifferent, hostile, or incompetent, you are powerless. The workshop intended to grant independence becomes just another asset in his property portfolio. And if he is cruel, if he squanders your inheritance, drinks your earnings, or beats you, the law offers almost no protection. Divorce in the modern sense does not exist. Legal separation is rare, expensive, and does not restore your legal identity or control over property. For most women, farmers' wives, daughters of tradesmen, servants, the law left them entirely at their husband's mercy. Survival required hope, and hope was all they had. In Tudor England, a girl's value as a woman was calculated from birth, not from her potential, intelligence, or talent. Fathers kept meticulous ledgers, recording daughters' portions alongside livestock and land values. A first daughter might receive 100 marks, a second 80, always precise, always transactional. Inheritance laws favored primogeniture. The eldest son inherited the family estate intact. Daughters received a dowry, a single payment of money or property that would be the extent of their inheritance. But the moment a daughter married, coverture ensured she could no longer control it. Her economic identity, her legal existence, became entirely her husband's. This system did more than assign property, it erased autonomy. Ordinary women experienced coverture in its purest form. They had to hope for competence, fairness, or kindness from their husbands. Hope, as always, was a fragile and unreliable strategy. And yet, life continued. Women navigated markets, managed households, and contributed labor, all while existing legally as extensions of their husbands. The cruelty of coverture was total, but invisible to many. It was not a dramatic execution or a public humiliation. It was a quiet, bureaucratic erasure of legal existence. By transforming women into property, society ensured that half the population could never act independently, could never hold legal authority, and could never control the fruits of their own labor. Think back to that 19-year-old in Yorkshire, standing in a church in her wedding gown, clutching her purse of earned coins. In that single legal act, her autonomy vanished. She remained alive, but she was, in the eyes of the law, dead. The system was deliberate, methodical, and normalized. It affected thousands, shaping society in ways that are easy to overlook in the grand narratives of kings and queens. Coverture persisted for centuries, and its effects shaped women's lives, property relations, and legal structures long after the Tudor era. It created an environment in which women's identities, wealth, and legal power were inseparable from their husbands. Their work, their inheritance, their very existence were mediated through the men to whom they were legally bound. In retrospect, the marriages of Henry VIII's wives, divorced, executed, or survived, were the visible extremes of a system whose real oppression was far more pervasive. Ordinary women lived under coverture every day. Their legal death went unnoticed by history, yet its consequences shaped families, economies, and society for generations. Understanding this legal framework reveals the full scope of Tudor injustice. It was not only monarchs who wielded power arbitrarily. The law itself had already preordained the erasure of half the population's agency. In a world where breathing did not guarantee existence, where earning and owning counted for nothing, survival required submission. And this is why exploring court records, wills, and legal manuscripts is so important. Beneath the tales of kings, queens, and beheadings lie the hidden histories of thousands of women whose legal lives ended on their wedding day. Their suffering was bureaucratic, systematic, and often invisible, but it was real. Envision a meeting in a prosperous London townhouse. Two fathers sit across a table, wine between them, documents spread out. They are negotiating their children's futures. "My daughter brings £200 in coin, plus household linens valued at £20, says the first man, a successful cloth merchant. "She's trained in household management. She reads and writes, and she's of excellent character. She's 16, sir." The second man, a minor gentleman with a small estate in Kent, nods. "The boy will provide her with a jointure, use of a third of his estate should he predecease her. She will have a chamber in the manor house, an annual allowance for clothing, and £20 settled on her immediately upon marriage. They might as well be trading horses." Notice what is missing from this conversation: the young people themselves. The daughter's feelings, her ambitions, her desires, irrelevant. She is a bundle of assets, a human ledger entry being transferred from one balance sheet to another. For daughters, this system was psychologically devastating. Their worth was quantified explicitly. A girl with a £200 dowry was worth twice as much as her sister with £100. Marriage prospects were determined by arithmetic, and everyone knew it. When the family's fortunes changed, disaster followed. A merchant family with 3 daughters could lose everything if a business collapsed, a ship sank, a partner defaulted, or plague struck. Suddenly, promised dowries could not be paid. The daughters became unmarketable. Courting men vanished. Marriage prospects evaporated. These women faced a future as unwanted dependents in their brothers' households, burdensome and without recourse. Even queens were not immune. Consider Catherine of Aragon. She married Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur, in 1501. Spain paid an enormous dowry, 200,000 crowns, roughly £40,000. When Arthur died months later, Catherine's parents demanded the dowry returned. Henry VIII refused. For 7 years, Catherine lived in England in uncertain poverty. Her dowry existed, but was inaccessible. Her status was unclear, her future uncertain. Catherine's experience, caught between two kingdoms, two marriages, treated as a piece of disputed property, was exceptional in scale but not in kind. Thousands of ordinary women faced similar disputes, their lives trapped in the machinery of dowry negotiations and inheritance law. These stories are not taught in schools. They are buried in legal documents, court records, and church archives. They reveal a hidden history, the law transforming women into property. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, subscribe and turn on notifications. The story is far from over. On July 11, 1533, Pope Clement VII issued a verdict. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was valid. His marriage to Anne Boleyn was invalid. Henry's response was swift and absolute. He rejected papal authority entirely, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and sentenced Catherine to a slow, humiliating death as a non-person. Catherine, Queen of England for 24 years, was stripped of her title. She became Princess Dowager of Wales. She was forbidden to see her daughter marry. She was moved from residence to residence, each smaller and more uncomfortable than the last. Her household was reduced, her income cut, and she was isolated, surveilled, and slowly broken. When she died in January 1536, many suspected poisoning. The truth was almost worse. She had been legally and socially murdered, erased while still alive. Every woman in England understood the message. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the most powerful monarchs in Europe. She was educated, intelligent, politically skilled, and beloved by the English people. For 2 decades, she had been a model queen, had borne Henry a surviving child, Mary, and had even served as regent, commanding the defense against a Scottish invasion. None of it mattered. When Henry wanted a son and a new wife, Catherine became disposable. If a queen with royal blood, powerful family connections, and decades of faithful service could be cast aside, what security did any other woman have? The message rippled through every level of society. Merchant wives whispered to each other in markets. Noble women at court grew silent and fearful. Every married woman in England now knew with absolute certainty that her legal and social standing depended entirely on her husband's approval. That approval, in turn, depended on factors often outside her control, particularly her ability to produce a male heir. Biologically, the odds were stacked against her. A woman has roughly a 50% chance of conceiving a male child in any given pregnancy. In Tudor England, approximately 15 to 20% of male children died in infancy, and more before adulthood. Producing even one surviving son was not guaranteed. Yet the pressure was relentless. A wife who bore only daughters was deemed a failure, not by medicine or biology, but by law, society, and often her own family. Henry's break with Rome created another catastrophe: the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, commissioners systematically shut down every monastery, priory, and convent. For monks, this was disruptive but manageable. Many could find work as parish priests or tutors, received pensions, and could marry under the new settlement. For nuns, however, the consequences were catastrophic. Nunneries had been among the few places where women could live semi-independent, structured lives outside male control. In Tudor England, the convent was one of the few places where women could live with genuine autonomy. A nun was not subject to coverture because she was not married. She answered to her abbess and her order, not to a father or husband. For educated women, for those who did not wish to marry, for those seeking a spiritual or intellectual life, the convent offered refuge. Consider Abbess Alice Montague of Barking Abbey. She presided over one of the wealthiest religious houses in England, managing vast estates, employing hundreds of people, wielding considerable local power. When commissioners arrived in 1539 to dissolve her abbey, she was forced to surrender everything. Her pension of £133 per year might sound generous until one considers she had managed an abbey generating over £1,000 annually. What could Alice do? She could not marry, she had taken solemn vows, and she had no family estate to return to. She had spent her life in religious service, not learning skills for secular survival. Her pension placed her in a strange limbo. Too much money for manual labor, too little for independent gentility, and no clear social position. Multiply Alice's story by thousands. Young nuns, some entering religious life as children, and older nuns who had spent 40 or 50 years cloistered, all faced the same crisis: displacement into a society that had no role for them. The pensions nuns received were consistently smaller than those given to monks. Some ended up destitute. The historical record contains heartbreaking petitions from former nuns begging for increased pensions, describing poverty and illness, appealing for aid that rarely came. The religious upheaval created a pervasive atmosphere of fear. The Treason Act of 1534 made it high treason to deny the king's supremacy over the church. But the law was broad and sweeping. It criminalized words as well as actions. Private spaces, the kitchen, the bedchamber, the sewing room, could become sites of treason. A woman expressing sympathy for the old queen or questioning the king's religious policies risked accusation. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was executed in 1541 at age 67, partly for family connections to the old royal line, but also for suspected loyalty to Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth Barton, the nun of Kent, was executed in 1534 for prophesying against the king's remarriage. And Askew was tortured and burned at the stake in 1546 for her Protestant beliefs. For ordinary women, the danger was subtler but just as real. A refusal to swear the oath of supremacy could cost her home, her position, and her security. If her husband were accused of treason, she and her children might be plunged into poverty with no legal recourse. In this system of comprehensive legal erasure, there was one strange path to personhood: widowhood. When a husband died, the legal covering of coverture lifted. A widow returned to being a woman with a legal identity. She could own property, make contracts, sue and be sued in her own name, run businesses, hire workers, and make binding decisions. For many women, this was the first time since childhood that they had legal recognition. Common law granted widows dower rights, typically a life interest in 1/3 of their husband's real estate. If her husband had been a craftsman or merchant, she might inherit his tools, his shop, and his business relationships. Widows often thrived economically. Take Joan Dance, a London brewer's widow in the 1530s. Upon her husband's death, she inherited his brewery. Within 5 years, she expanded the business, purchased 2 additional properties, and became one of the largest beer suppliers in her neighborhood. She hired workers, sued debtors, and managed complex commercial dealings, activities she legally could not have undertaken as a married woman. Court records from cities like London and towns across England are filled with widows suing to recover debts, running taverns and inns, working as drapers and haberdashers, and managing rural estates. Widows appear in the records disproportionately because they were the only women with legal standing to engage in such activities independently. But this freedom was double-edged. A widow bore sole responsibility for her survival. She inherited debts along with property. If her late husband's business failed, she had no male protector to intervene. Younger widows with property faced intense pressure to remarry. Family members might push them toward a new match, and scrupulous men might attempt to exploit them. And if a widow did remarry, coverture returned. The moment she said, "I do," she lost legal independence. All property she controlled, the land, the business, the money, became her new husband's. She returned to legal non-existence. Consider Elena, widowed at 35 in 1528. Her husband, a successful goldsmith, left her his shop, tools, and materials. As a widow, Elena discovered capabilities she had never realized. Within 2 years, she ran a profitable operation, took on apprentices, and expanded into silver work. Yet pressures mounted. Her late husband's family hinted she should remarry, ideally to a male relative to keep the property in the family. Her own family pushed her toward a wealthy mercer. Male goldsmiths in her guild resented her success and attempted to restrict her activities. The prospect of companionship was tempting, but Elena knew the consequences. Remarry, and everything she had built would return to coverture. Her shop, her hard-won independence, all her achievements would vanish beneath her new husband's legal control. This was the widow's dilemma: freedom or companionship, autonomy or security. For men, marriage offered both. For women, the choice was mutually exclusive. Not all widows had Elena's options. Poor widows, elderly widows, and widows without valuable property faced desperate circumstances. Parish records from Tudor England are full of widows receiving poor relief, small payments from the church to keep them from starving. A widow's survival often depended on the goodwill of relatives, neighbors, and parish officials, none of whom had any legal obligation to help her. What you are witnessing is systematic legal erasure, a centuries-old system that treated women's personhood as negotiable. The legal reality of coverture was absolute, but the practical reality of Tudor life was more complex. Women found ways to work within, around, and occasionally against the system. Many marriages functioned as economic partnerships. A merchant's wife might run the shop while her husband traveled. A farmer's wife managed household production, brewing, dairy, textiles, that generated significant income. These women weren't legally empowered. They worked at their husband's pleasure, subject to his authority. Yet the economic reality was that many families couldn't survive without women's labor and skill. Some women pushed back directly, though they paid for it. And Boleyn, before her fall, was notorious for her bold speech. She argued theology with Henry VIII, interfered in political matters, and refused to play the submissive wife. Her behavior scandalized the court and gave her enemies ammunition. When Henry turned against her, her outspoken nature was cited as evidence of unsuitability. She was executed on May 19, 1536, officially for adultery and treason. The charges were almost certainly false. Her real crimes were speaking too freely, failing to produce a male heir, and making powerful men uncomfortable. For most women, resistance wasn't about grand political statements. It was about survival and small acts of autonomy. A woman might hide money from a spendthrift husband, claiming she had earned less than she had. She might run a small trade and pocket some earnings before handing the rest to him. Were these acts theft? Technically, no. Under coverture, a wife couldn't steal from her husband because she legally couldn't own property. But morally, these women were reclaiming tiny pieces of themselves in a system designed to deny them any. Some women tried to avoid coverture entirely by refusing marriage. Wealthy women who inherited property in their own right sometimes remained single to maintain control of their estates. They faced enormous pressure to marry, but if they could weather it, they could live as a femme sole their entire lives. Elizabeth I is the most famous example. She famously declared herself married to England and refused all suitors. But this wasn't just political theater. Elizabeth understood that marriage would destroy her power. Under coverture, her husband would legally control her person and property. She couldn't risk it. Coverture didn't end with the Tudors. It didn't end with the Stuarts, Georgians, or Victorians. The legal doctrine that erased married women's identities persisted in English law until the Married Women's Property Acts of the late 19th century, more than 300 years after Henry VIII's death. The first significant reform came in 1870, allowing women to keep their own earned wages. Full property rights for married women didn't arrive until 1882. Think about that timeline. The system that turned women into legal property existed longer than the United States has existed as a nation. Women born in the Tudor period, raised under coverture, married under coverture, died under coverture, and their daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters all lived under the same system. Coverture wasn't just a legal technicality. It was the legal expression of a deeper ideology, that women were not fully human in the way men were. They were dependents, perpetual children requiring male guardianship. This ideology shaped everything. It justified women's exclusion from universities, from professions, and from political participation. If a woman couldn't legally sign a contract, how could she be a lawyer? If she couldn't own property, how could she be a merchant? If her legal identity was subsumed by her husband, how could she vote or hold office? Legal erasure enabled and justified social erasure. Women's experiences were deemed unimportant, their voices irrelevant, their suffering invisible. When historians later told the story of the Tudor period, they focused on kings, parliaments, and wars, all male domains. The quiet, systemic oppression of women barely registered. History remembers Henry VIII for beheading 2 wives. But the real toll was far higher and far quieter. For every queen who lost her head, thousands of ordinary women lost their legal existence. The merchant's daughter whose husband destroyed her business. The widow who tasted freedom only to surrender it for companionship. The wife who died giving birth to the son who would make her valuable. Their names are gone, their voices silenced. But they survived a system that declared them less than human, not through violence, but through law. We have abolished coverture, but in doing so, we buried its victims with it. These women deserve more than our pity. They deserve remembrance. Their lives remind us that legal systems can be as deadly as swords, that oppression can operate quietly through rules and contracts, and that survival in a system built to erase you can require extraordinary resilience. What other legal horrors are hiding in history? Drop your thoughts below.